Hello, and this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 11, Day 7. Today's journal, we're going to talk about 3 things that you learned from yesterday's assignment. Okay, that can be from the notes, anything that you picked up through Day 6. And I would like for you to write at least 1 to 2 sentences, no one-word answer, okay, for each of the 3 things. So that's 1 to 2 sentences for each of the 3 things, not one sentence with all 3 things in it. Now, today we're going to be talking about John F. Kennedy. All right, we're going to talk about his election and the Cold War. Now, some essential questions. How did JFK attempt to avoid nuclear war during his presidency? And how did his domestic programs attempt to empower Americans? Now, one of the first things that we'll talk about that was going on during this time, kind of right here at the beginning of the 60s, is the Woolworth sit-ins. And we're going to start talking about some civil rights issues over the course of the next couple of days of notes, kind of mixed in with all the other things going on during this time. But a sit-in was a form of direct action that involves one or more persons that are non-violently occupying an area for a protest. So essentially, you go into a place where maybe they're doing something that you feel is against someone's rights, or they're discriminating, or whatever the case may be, and you essentially sit there and keep them from being able to use that spot for business. Now, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 students vowed to sit at a whites-only Woolworth lunch counter until they were served, and these were African-American students. By the end of the week, there were 300 strong, and within 2 months, sit-ins spread to over 54 cities and 9 states, including hotels, movie theaters, swimming pools, and restaurants. Now, at first, NAACP and the SCLC were weary about sit-ins, okay, and these were predominantly African American organizations that were concerned about the image or the direction that these protests were going to take. Mainly because they feared that these students didn't have the discipline to remain nonviolent. Students were burnt with coffee, cigarettes, acid, heckled, beaten with clubs, kicked, punched, but for the most part, most of those who were involved did not fight back. Here's a picture of the Woolworth sit-in. Okay, and the funny thing about it is, guys, is that in most of these restaurants and these places, you did have African American workers, but in some cases, there were places that it was whites only, and essentially they were fighting against segregation. John Salter, John Trumpier, and Ann Moody sitting in a downtown Woolworths in Jackson, Mississippi on May 28, 1963. One student was drug off a chair and beaten, one hit with brass knuckles, and they had poured salt in their wounds, coffee poured on their heads, but they remained throughout the day. And you can see the amount of people that are behind them at this counter. I mean, this isn't a big restaurant, but that's generally what happened. You know, it upset a lot of white people and people who were just, in many terms, racist. Um, Now, in Harlem and many other northern communities, the movement supporters picketed the Woolworth and other chain stores to support the southern sit-ins. And so what's going on in North Carolina is going to spread throughout the rest of the country. It's going to influence those people in New York and Pennsylvania and Vermont and Delaware. All those people up north are going to begin to see this media coverage and these things in the news, and they're going to start getting behind this and trying to show their support. And generally, guys, it's no different than what we see today in some of the things that have gone on with um, uh, police brutality. That's been a big issue in the news. When one group of people began trying to advocate and protest against police brutality, there was another group of people in a different area that stood up with them, but as a result of their protest. And so it's kind of been a common thing. Now, getting into kind of the headliner of our notes today, and we'll come back to civil rights stuff, so don't worry. If you're real interested in some of that information, we will talk about it again, as well as we'll go over some of it in class. Now, in the election of 1960, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy ran against each other, and it was a televised debate, and they spoke of a new frontier. Okay, specifically, they were talking about space and how the country was going to address space and the issues thereof. Now, one of the things that favored Kennedy during this election was that Nixon was visibly sweating. And those who watched the debate thought that Kennedy won mainly because Nixon looked like he was possibly lying, that he was nervous, whereas those who listened on the radio, they thought Nixon won because he was a good speaker and he did have a way about him as a politician, but visibly, if you could see him, it would make you really nervous about wanting to vote for him. However, Kennedy does win the election. Uh, uh, Jackie Kennedy describing JFK's presidency, and I kind of given you a spoiler there that he was assassinated if you did not know that. But after his assassination, they described the time in the White House as idyllic happiness. Okay, and the White House comes to be known as Camelot, kind of referring back to the Knights of the Round Table and Arthur. Jacqueline Kennedy came from wealth. She saw the White House as the center for arts, music, and theater while she was there. She tried to promote those things as a president's wife. They had 2 young children and were photographed very often. They're one of the most photographed presidents and his wife in history. And these are the first children that are in the White House since 1908. Okay. Now, here's a picture of President Kennedy and Jackie. Okay, you can see them here. And this is kind of my point of how much they were photographed. But they're going to kind of set the stage for how presidents and presidents' wives and family, how they're kind of open to the media and how they kind of show what's going on. Now, in 1957, before the election had begun, the Soviet Union had launched their first satellite into space, resulting in an increased emphasis on quality education, specifically in science and math in the United States, because we feared we were losing the space race to the Reds. Okay, Sputnik was proof that the Soviets had also created an intercontinental ballistic missile. And this development of rocket equipment and interplanet communication meant that there was also the case that they probably had the ability of a nuclear missile. And it also showed that we were losing the race into the space age. So the United States is going to develop the National Aeronautics Space Administration, and this is going to be the formation of NASA, and they're going to launch their first satellite in 1958 called Explorer 1. Now, one of the other big things going on during Kennedy's presidency is there was also a push towards the federal government's involvement in what we knew it as DDTs, but basically helping the environment. It's kind of one of the first real environmental movements that we'll talk about in the 60s. But 1962, a former Research and Fish and Wildlife Service member, she wrote a book detailing the problems caused by the use of insecticide DDT. And Rachel Carson said that there would be a silent spring because there would be no birds chirping, which led many states to ban DDTs, and so did the federal government. Now, this is the influence of, not only a woman, but also this is the influence of different movements. And you're going to start seeing more movements, especially during the 1960s, start to pop up towards different causes. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring said that industrialization had caused many environmental damages, and it launches the first environmental movement as far as what's one of the real biggest ones. And it questioned toxicity concerning nuclear fallout and also the involvement of nuclear plants and all these things. Also, it studied the effects of pesticides on the environment, which led to testing of the air and water qualities, things that had never been done. It started to try to put kind of these factories in the limelight of things that need to be done. Now, she's also going to help get past the Clean Air Act, which regulated automobiles and industrial emissions, and the government had become involved in environmental problems for the first time. So that's all we're going to talk about for today. We'll pick up right there and kind of continue on with day 8. A ton to cover in the 60s and this time period. Please make sure you keep it up with your vocabulary, keep it up with your journals and your notes. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.